Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had the chance to have a quick stretch or grab a cup of tea. I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on some of the fantastic presentations that we've had so far, covering all different stages of the caring trajectory, as well as some different experiences. It's been so interesting to hear about the research that's happening in this space, with our early career researchers. Our fourth presentation today is by Hannah Isaac, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney. And her presentation will talk about key lessons in the development of interventions and resources for cancer carers, co-design of the CarersCanACCESS Decision Support Tool. Thanks so much, Hannah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here able to present today. I really appreciate it. Today is going to be an overview of one of the projects within my PhD. Before I get into it, I do just want to thank the Psycho-Oncology Cooperative Research Group and my wonderful supervisors, including Beck, for their ongoing support, but as well as the Sydney Cancer Partners who provided us with a seed grant, without which we wouldn't actually be able to put together the resource that I'll be showing you today. So quick overview of kind of what the problem is where it got to me during my PhD. So many of us are familiar and we're well aware of the significant physical, financial, social, and psychological challenges that carers can face. But the focus of my research is on the psychological challenges particularly. Now, psychological support services and interventions can help manage these impacts. However, what we often find is that there's a treatment engagement gap where even though carers often desire support and they experience high levels of distress, very few actually engage with these support services themselves. There are a plethora of things that contribute to this gap. You've got systems, societal, and individual factors. And I will just say that last year I was able to present on some attitudinal barriers that can stop carers from seeking support. And there's a QR code there for the full paper now that's been published. But on those kind of individual and attitudinal factors, they can include things like mental health stigma, beliefs about being a carer, comparison to the needs of others, feeling like the patient is the priority, all those sorts of things. And while we may not be able to amend or change all those systems and societal factors, the individual factors are actually amenable to intervention. And in a sister quantitative review that we conducted that's currently under review for publication, we found that there were no care-specific interventions designed to actually increase uptake with psychological services. So that's where our study came in. So what we did is we co-designed a brief cancer care-specific resource that aimed to address the attitudinal barriers to support seeking, provide psychoeducation to help carers kind of identify their need for support and also understand what their options actually are. And then finally, facilitate informed decision making and actually empower carers to make those decisions based on their context, values, and needs. And just quickly, we chose cancer care specific because within the review that we conducted, we found that carers often wanted tailored and disease-specific support. And so we just chose cancer as a proof of concept. Now, in terms of the resource format, while we did do a co-design approach where we worked with professionals and carers to kind of develop the resource and refine, the language, the look and feel, the content, all those sorts of things, we wanted to make sure that the format itself was empirically grounded and was going to appropriately address the issue at hand. And what we found was that mental health literacy was identified as a key factor when it came to support seeking in both our quantitative and qualitative reviews. And so mental health literacy or higher levels of mental health literacy are associated with reduced mental health stigma, an increased awareness of needs, and also an increased ability to identify and access appropriate support options. And so decision support tools, or decision aids as you might know them, are a really great strategy in terms of actually improving mental health literacy. And so if you're not familiar, they're essentially these resources or tools that help people weigh up the pros and cons of their options, and they facilitate informed decision making. They help people kind of reflect on what their values and top priorities are so that they can make sure they're making decisions that are appropriate for their context and needs. And at the moment, till now, I guess, no decision support tools have actually been developed to support carers in making decisions about seeking support for themselves. So as I mentioned, it's a co-design approach. We went back and forth with carers and professionals. And our analysis kind of involved a two-part analysis. So we had those service level changes of like, actually, what do we need to refine throughout the resource? But we also did a thematic analysis because throughout our interviews, we found that there were just these kind of underlying things that kept coming up that were kind of the foundation for people's feedback on kind of the design and content and feedback on implementation and things like that. And so I wanted to focus on them specifically. And so we identified 5 key themes. And I won't go through all of these in detail because there is a lot to unpack here. But essentially we had, attitudinal things like, stigmatized belief about mental health, not wanting to be seen as weak and things like that. Beliefs about being a carer, so a tendency, not to identify as one or prioritizing patient needs over their own. These cancer-related factors as well. So, treatment schedules, the actual health of the patient and things like that. Practical constraints, lack of time, finances, the availability of services and all those sorts of things. And then finally, health literacy was identified as a key factor. So, not knowing what's available, not knowing how to access it, but also kind of perceiving clinically significant levels of distress as almost normal and not something that necessitates support. And as you can see, all of these things had influence on support seeking, and they also had influences on design content and implementation considerations. So, these findings kind of expand upon some of the attitudinal barriers that we had identified in our systematic review. And we summarize these findings into kind of 3 key lessons that I think are just something good for us to consider, when we're developing psychological support services and resources and interventions for carers. So the first thing is kind of this idea of how is the purpose of this supportive resource actually pitched. So overall, carers do have that tendency to prioritize practical and patient-oriented services over emotional support for themselves. And so they may be less likely to engage with services that heavily advertise on addressing the emotional needs of carers. We don't want to kind of deceive carers as to the purpose of our resources and support services and things like that. But it's just that idea of being a little bit more nuanced, perhaps, in how we're going about advertising these services. Seeking support goes against that carer role expectation. And when you link that in with mental health literacy, where carers feel that they need to be strong for their loved one, but they see seeking support as a sign of weakness, that's kind of at conflict with each other. And so, just going about things in a way that reduces any stigma or shame associated with seeking support, but also, highlights the benefits of seeking support for them and the person they care for, still acknowledging their intrinsic right to support, but just carers may be a little bit more open to support if we just acknowledge those sorts of things. And then, like I said, strengths-based approaches. That was a really big thing when it came to the language when we talked about support, of just making sure that we're talking about these support services as proactive coping rather than an acceptance of kind of almost defeat or failure or anything like that. The second thing is just that interplay between practical and emotional needs. So over time, carer needs do tend to shift from information and patient-based kind of concerns to personal health, adjustment, and psychosocial concerns. And so at the beginning, immediately after, diagnosis or carers are brought into this sort of role, they may not necessarily have the capacity or willingness to engage with services in that immediate kind of critical stage there. Now, early intervention can obviously help alleviate escalating distress and things like that, but it just may need to be that consideration of when we're first introducing things and actually then reintroducing things over, in our case, the cancer trajectory, but just over the stages and progression of caring. And so, again, just adopting that more holistic lens that actually accounts for the practical needs of carers and how that can then interplay with their levels of distress and things like that. And on that kind of practical note, carers are time poor. This is a well-known fact, but lengthy resources, not that they're a bad thing. We don't want to, only be like carer resources have to be brief, but just that briefer resources or resources that allow for flexible kind of engagement and things like that may increase engagement. And so, flexible support options, things like, web-based interventions, or like brief services may, like I said, increase that engagement. And so finally, just the idea of the use of the term carer. This has been brought up a little bit today, but yeah, carers are unlikely to identify with the term carer. And so, there's a preference to see themselves as spouse, partner, brother, sister, whatever it happens to be. So, there was discussion within our interviews of like, it's not about replacing the word or finding a new word or things like that, because it is the word that health systems use, but it's more about clearly normalizing and actually defining the term. So, actually making that really clear from the get-go. And then also when it comes to implementation and advertising, yes, there's that role of health professionals when it comes to identifying carers. If you're in a consult and there's a partner who's with there, just being like, hey, this could be a caring role, but also a couple of health professionals and carers actually acknowledge the role that patients might have in distributing these sorts of resources, of just being like, okay, who's your support network? Who are the people who might benefit from this? That kind of leads me all into the resource that we made. And so this is the Carers Can Access resource, and currently undergoing a pilot study, which is very exciting, but I'm going to basically give you a whiz-bang tour of the resource and also just a little bit of an overview of how we kind of integrated some of our findings into the resource and just considerations that we made along the way. So the resource has four main components. The first thing is the idea of should I seek support? So this is where, there's some psychoeducation about distress, anxiety, depression. There's some reflective exercises. And in this first, it's where we're really trying to address some of those attitudinal barriers to support seeking. The next bit is what are my support options? So again, this is where the decision support tool really comes in, and it's giving the definitions, benefits, and drawbacks of different service options. And we actually chose 8 service options. We really wanted to make it clear to carers that there are a range of support services that are available to them. It's not just psychology. So the services that we have are information support helplines, self-led programs, chaplaincy and pastoral care, peer support programs, counsellors, GPs, social workers, and psychologists. So a range of service options there. After that, it's this actual values clarification exercise, essentially, of what support seems best to me, where we ask carers which service qualities matter most to you, and then based on that, we provide them with tailored service recommendations based on their top preferences. And then finally, the practical steps of how to access support. So again, those practical needs coming in, mental health literacy and things like that, wanting to make sure that we don't just finish on, great, here's the support option we recommend, but we actually guide them all the way through to here's how you access it. So this is what carers would see when they first access the resource. You can see the sections along the slide that I just went through. I won't obviously go through all of it. It is still brief, but I won't go through all of it. I'll just show you a couple of key things along the way. So the first thing is the idea of just, defining and normalizing the term carer. And so when it came to, who the resource was for, that was where we actually just naturally integrated the term carer. And so we went through some things that people might do in that supportive role. And then, just like the patient refers to the person with cancer, care, it's the word the health system uses for family and friends who take on these extra tasks during the experience. So just rather than being like, this is for carers, we just introduce it as this is for family and friends, and then we integrate the term carer in there. Pitching of the resource, acknowledging that their time and energy are precious, acknowledging some of those practical barriers and practical needs, and then saying that we actually want to help them with that. We want to make sure that seeking emotional support and navigating service options is clear and easy and confident. Psychoeducation, so, we go through some things about what distress is, what it might look like, and things like that. But in that, we're just naturally integrating some of those, addressing the attitudinal barriers and stigma. So, acknowledging that distress is not a sign of weakness or failure. And then this is a really key thing where we address some of the attitudinal barriers. So we have a section where we originally had this labeled as misconceptions about seeking support, but we actually changed it because it seemed a bit intense to carers when we were getting their feedback. And it was just like common thoughts and worries, which is how a lot of them feel about seeking support. And so where these quotes come from is a lot of the stuff that we did within our systematic review. And then if carers click on these, they would get a kind of pop up, which would have a simple response. So that first one, like if I'm not the one who's sick or I shouldn't need support, the pop-up is this idea that seeking support is like filling up on a tank of petrol, and it's not selfish to fill up on your tank. It's actually essential to make sure that you and the person you care for can both keep going. So we're just naturally integrating that idea of support seeking being beneficial for both parties as well. Now we go through service options. Decision support tools are all about providing pros, cons, definitions, all those sorts of things, and we naturally are challenging any sort of misconceptions along the way. And then now this might look a little overwhelming, and we got this feedback from carers as well, but this is essentially the summarized summary of the service options. And so you can see kind of these service qualities along the side, and this is where, we kind of factor in some of those practical things. But we did get feedback originally that this was quite overwhelming, and carers didn't want to have to try and navigate this on their own based on their top preferences. So this is where we had the tailored service recommendations, and we refined things a little bit more, made it a bit more interactive. So basically what happens is, based on those service qualities, we get carers to pick whether it doesn't matter to them, matters little, or matters a lot. So in this context, as the example, Helen, she wants something that has no out-of-pocket cost, is flexible with her schedule, and is accessible from anywhere. And then based on that table that I just showed you, services that best match Helen's top 3 priorities include helplines and self-led programs. But other possible matches include chaplaincy, GP, and social worker. And so people can, click on the table, have that interaction, and then if they did want to see more, they could still have access to the table, accounting for different levels of mental health literacy and preferences for information. But yeah, that's the key crux of our resource. And then, yeah, like I said, just the practical steps to making sure that people actually feel supported in the full step along the way. So yeah, a bit of a whiz bang tour, but the resource is designed to be brief. And so, yeah, in summary, there are low levels of engagement with emotional support services among carers, but we developed a novel resource to actually facilitate informed decision making and hopefully support seeking among carers. And along the way, we just find that there were some key considerations that kind of influenced our refinement of the resource, but also key considerations for the development and implementation of other psychological services and resources, just to help maximize carer engagement. So that was, how's the resource pitch, making sure that we're defining and normalizing the term carer, and just considering that interplay between practical and emotional needs. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was such a great presentation and such an important resource that you're developing and piloting. If you have questions for Hannah, you can pop those in the chat or using the Q&A function. And while we wait for those to come through, I'll start with a question for Hannah. I was wondering a bit more about your co-design process. It's so great to hear that you interviewed both carers and healthcare professionals. I was wondering if you could talk about what were some of the differences or similarities between the feedback from the two groups.
Yeah, so similar things of like, sometimes the professionals actually assumed that carers wanted less knowledge than what they had, and that could be a reflection, actually, just the sample of carers that we had. But I think across both groups, they were like, you're just wanting providing the option for flexible levels of engagement, providing the option for, some content being mandatory versus other content being kind of more interactive. You can read more if you want to. Across both, none of them had particular feedback on kind of the look and feel of the resource. A lot of them were a lot more focused on kind of the language. Both groups highlighted just the importance of having really a strengths-based approach. And it was interesting because we tried to make those refinements after our interviews with professionals, but even then in the care round of interviews where we were going back and forth, they were still just wanting more of a refinement, where some felt that they were like, it still just feels very like, you're failing, so you should seek support. And they're just like, I want to actually do more proactive. This is good for me and my loved one and things like that. Again, both groups actually, they talked about how, acknowledging the benefits for the patient is really helpful. And we were hesitant to do that at the beginning because we were like, oh, but isn't it about, providing support to the loved one? But the clinicians were like, this is the strategy that works. And when we went to carers, they were like, honestly, some of them had access support and some of them hadn't. And we had some bereaved carers as well, which was a really interesting sort of perspective. But yeah, they were like, look, I appreciate that the resource acknowledges my needs as a whole, but there is that level of I'm more inclined to engage with resources if I actually think it's going to benefit my loved one as well, because otherwise I just feel selfish. Like, so it was interesting to see while there were some minor differences, they actually did line up a fair bit across both.
That's so interesting to hear about that mutual benefit framing of the resource. Um, we'll head over to our next presentation. I'll pass over to Beck. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really great.